Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story you think you already know. You've heard about Ma Ingalls, that steady, unshakable woman in the bonnet, always calm, always capable, the mother who kept her family alive through blizzards and grasshopper plagues and poverty so deep it had teeth. You know her from the books, from the TV show, from 100 retellings that made her into something close to a saint. But tonight, you're not meeting that woman. Tonight, you're meeting the 5-year-old girl who learned the hardest lesson of her life on a November afternoon in 1845, when a man came to the door and told her mother that her father was never coming home. You're meeting Caroline Lake Quiner before she became Ma Ingalls, before she learned to swallow grief like medicine, before she spent 42 years following a restless man across 4 states, while everything she built kept crumbling behind her. You're standing in Brookfield, Wisconsin. The year is 1839, and the date is December 12th. The air smells like wood smoke and snow, and somewhere in a frame house near the banks of Lake Michigan you're being born. Your name is Caroline Lake Quiner, and you don't know it yet, but you're one of the earliest settlers born in this territory, in a place that's barely finished being carved out of the wilderness. Your father is Henry Newcomb Quiner, and when you're old enough to understand what that means, you'll know he's different from other men. He doesn't just farm, he trades. He travels to the Native American villages, learning languages, exchanging goods, building relationships that other white settlers are too afraid or too arrogant to build. He takes boats across Lake Michigan, carrying lumber and promises, disappearing for weeks at a time while your mother Charlotte waits at home with you and your brothers and sisters, pretending she's not counting the days until he returns. You have older brothers, Joseph and Henry. You have an older sister, Martha Jane. You'll have younger siblings too, Eliza and Thomas, a house that fills with noise and bodies and the constant work of keeping everyone fed and clothed and warm enough to survive another Wisconsin winter. Your childhood is ordinary in the way frontier childhoods are ordinary, which means it's filled with labour you're too young to understand is unusual. And Weifelrust. You learn to help with household chores when your hands are barely big enough to hold the tools. You learn to be useful, to be quiet when adults are talking, to understand that children who don't contribute don't get to complain. You learn that life is hard, but your family is together, and that makes everything bearable, and you learn to watch the lake. Lake Michigan is beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. It stretches to the horizon like an ocean, grey-green and restless, its moods changing faster than you can read them. When your father leaves on his trading trips, you stand near the water and watch him go. And something in your chest tightens, a feeling you don't have words for yet. Years later, you'll recognise it as the fear that lives in every woman who watches a man she loves walk toward danger. It's November 1845, and you're 5 years old. Your father has been gone for weeks, working as second mate on a lumber schooner called the Ocean. He's never worked on ships before. He's a farmer, a trader, a man who knows land and language and how to bargain with indigenous peoples over furs and goods. But the economy's changing, and farming alone doesn't feed a family of 7. So he's taken work on the lake, learning to be a sailor in his mid-30s, trying to provide for a wife and children who need him to come home whole. The news arrives on a cold afternoon when the sky's the colour of old iron. A man comes to your door, someone you don't know, and you watch from across the room as he talks to your mother in a voice too low for you to hear. You watch her hands go still on the fabric she's mending. You watch her stand up very slowly, like she's afraid if she moves too fast she'll shatter into pieces too small to gather back together. Your father's ship went down in a storm. The schooner Ocean, a lumber vessel crossing Lake Michigan, capsized in violent winds near St. Joseph, Michigan. When another ship found the wreckage, it was still floating, kept afloat by its cargo of lumber. The lifeboat was gone. The crew was gone. Your father was gone. Some bodies washed ashore in the days that followed. Your father wasn't one of them. He's somewhere at the bottom of Lake Michigan, in water so cold and deep that his body will never be recovered, never be buried, never be mourned over a grave where you can leave flowers and pretend he's resting peacefully. You don't understand death yet. Not really. You understand that your father isn't coming home, that your mother cries at night when she thinks you're asleep, that there's suddenly not enough food, and your older brothers have to work harder and the neighbours start bringing baskets of bread with faces full of pity that makes you feel small and ashamed. What you don't understand yet is that this moment is teaching you something you'll carry for the rest of your life. Men leave, and sometimes they don't come back, and the women and children they leave behind have to figure out how to survive anyway. Your mother is Charlotte Quiner now, a widow with 6 children and no income in a territory that has no mercy for women in her position. She could remarry quickly, out of desperation, to any man who'd take her and her children. She could send some of you away to live with relatives. She could fall apart. Many women do. The frontier is littered with graves of women who couldn't carry the weight of widowhood and motherhood and poverty all at once. She doesn't. Instead, she does something remarkable. She holds your family together through a combination of pride, stubbornness, and help from unexpected places. The Potawatomi families your father traded with, the ones who knew him as a fair man who kept his word, they don't forget. They bring venison. They bring wild rice. They bring the kind of practical compassion that keeps children from starving when winter presses down like a hand over your mouth. Your mother takes in sowing. She grows vegetables in soil that fights back. She accepts help from the church congregation, swallowing her pride because pride doesn't feed children. And slowly, painfully, she keeps you all alive. You're watching all of this. You're 5, then 6, then 7, and you're learning lessons that will shape every decision you make for the rest of your life. You're learning that survival isn't a given. You're learning that women who depend entirely on men end up alone with hungry children and no options. You're learning that the world is brutal and unfair, and the only way through it is to be tougher than the brutality. And you're learning something else, something you won't be able to name until much later. You will never be helpless like this again. The years pass slowly when you're a child, measuring time in meals that might not come. Your mother remarries in 1848 when you're 9 years old. His name is Frederick Holbrook, and he's a farmer, steady and solid in all the ways your father wasn't. He doesn't travel. He doesn't take risks. Mialasakam. He works the same land day after day, year after year, and there's safety in that predictability, even if there's no magic, no adventure, no stories about trading with indigenous peoples, or crossing the lake in storms that could kill you. Your family moves to Concord, in Jefferson County, following Holbrook to his farm. Life settles into something resembling stability. There's food on the table most days. There's a roof that doesn't leak. There's the steady rhythm of planting and harvest, of seasons that turn predictably, of a stepfather who comes home every night because he never leaves in the morning. But you can't forget. You can't forget the afternoon your father died, the years of hunger that followed, the way your mother's hands shook when she thought no one was watching. You can't forget that safety is an illusion, that the world can take everything from you in a single storm, and that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. So you do something unusual for a girl in 1850s Wisconsin. You get an education. Not everyone approves. Education for girls is seen as frivolous at best, dangerous at worst. What does a future wife and mother need with book learning? What good are reading and writing when you'll be managing a household, bearing children, preserving food for winter? Some people whisper that educated women become difficult, that they get ideas above their station, that they forget their place. You don't care. You attend school when most girls your age have already left to work full-time at home. You learn to read fluently, to write in a clear hand, to do mathematics, to speak with confidence. And when you're 16 years old, in October of 1858, you do something even more remarkable. You become a teacher. The teaching contract is dated October 1858. You'll teach school in Concord for 3 months, and you'll be paid $10 per month, $30 total. It's not much, but it's yours. Money you've earned with your own mind and your own labour. Money that doesn't depend on a husband or a father or anyone else's permission. You stand in front of a classroom full of children, some of them nearly as old as you are, and you teach them to read. You teach them arithmetic. You teach them that knowledge is a kind of power, the kind that can't be taken away by storms or shipwrecks or bad luck. And you feel something you haven't felt since your father died, a sense of control over your own life. You're 19 years old when you meet Charles Ingalls, and everything you've built is about to be tested in ways you can't imagine. The Holbrook farm is near the Ingalls property, close enough that you see the Ingalls family at church, at community gatherings, at the kind of social events that fill the spaces between planting and harvest. There's a son, Charles Philip Ingalls. Everyone calls him Charles, or Charlie when they're being familiar. He's in his 20s, 9 years older than you, a young man with restless energy and a smile that makes him popular at dances and socials. He's good with his hands, good at hunting, good at the kind of practical skills frontier life demands. He plays the fiddle, and when he does, people stop what they're doing to listen. He notices you. You're not sure when it starts exactly. Maybe it's at a church social, seasons where you're helping serve food and he's charming the older women with stories about hunting deer in the woods. Maybe it's at a dance where he plays his fiddle and watches you over the crowd, his eyes following you in a way that makes your skin warm. Maybe it's just the slow accumulation of moments in a small community where young people don't have many options, and proximity turns into familiarity, turns into something that feels like affection. He courts you the way young men court young women in 1859 Wisconsin. He walks you home from church. He comes to call at your mother and stepfather's house, sitting in the parlour making polite conversation, while your mother watches him with the assessing gaze of a woman who knows what it means to choose wrong. He talks about his plans, about land opening up in the West. He asks about opportunity and independence and building something of his own. You listen, and you hear two things at once. You hear a man who wants to build a future, who wants to provide, who has ambition and energy, and the kind of confidence that makes you believe he can do what he says he'll do. But you also hear something else. You hear restlessness. You hear a man who's never satisfied with where he is, who's always looking toward the horizon, who talks about moving west the same way your father talked about crossing the lake. Like it's an adventure instead of a risk, like excitement matters more than stability, like tomorrow's promise is worth today's sacrifice. You're 19 years old, and you've been supporting yourself as a teacher. You could keep teaching. You could stay single, build a reputation, save money, maintain the independence you fought for. You could wait for someone else, someone more settled, someone who wants to plant roots instead of chase horizons. But Charles is handsome. He's charming. He makes you laugh. And when he asks you to marry him, when he promises you a home and stability and a future built together, you want to believe him. So on February 1st, 1860, you stand in Concord, Wisconsin, and you marry Charles Philip Ingalls. You're 20 years old. He's 24. Your witnesses are Peter Ingalls, Charles's brother, and Martha Quiner, your sister. You're wearing your best dress. You're holding Charles's hand. You're making promises about love and honour, and staying together until death parts you. And you don't know yet that what you're really promising is to follow him across 4 states, through failure after failure, watching him chase something that never quite exists while you do the actual work of keeping your family alive. You don't know yet that home will become a word that means nothing, a temporary stop between movements, a place you'll learn not to get attached to because attachment only makes leaving hurt more. You don't know yet that you've just married your father's restlessness, that you've chosen the very thing you swore you'd avoid, that the man you're looking at with love is going to spend the next 20 years dragging you toward horizons that retreat faster than you can reach them. All you know right now is that you're married. You're Mrs. Charles Ingalls. You're standing next to a man who plays the fiddle like it's the only language that matters, who talks about the future like it's a place you can actually get to, who looks at you like you're the answer to a question he's been asking his whole life. You're 20 years old, and you're in love, and you think that's enough. You think love can survive anything. You're about to spend the next 42 years learning exactly what anything means. You're 20 years old, newly married, and you're about to learn what home means when your husband is Charles Ingalls. It's 1862, and you're standing in Pepin County, Wisconsin, watching your husband and his brother Peter and your brother-in-law Henry Quiner cut logs for a cabin that will be your first real home as a married woman. 2 years have passed since your wedding. 2 years of living with Charles's parents, of sharing space and resources, of learning what it means to be married to a man whose idea of a good plan is to move 7 miles into the forest, away from neighbours, away from town, away from everything resembling the security you grew up valuing. They call this area the Big Woods, and the name isn't poetic, it's literal. The forest here is so dense that sunlight struggles to reach the ground. The trees grow thick and tall, their canopies interlocking overhead, turning midday into twilight even in summer. Deer move through the shadows like ghosts. Bears leave claw marks on tree trunks. Wolves howl close enough at night to make your breath catch in your throat. This is opportunity, Charles tells you. This is independence. This is what you've been working toward. What it really is: isolated, remote, dangerously far from help if anything goes wrong. But you're pregnant with your first child, and pregnant women don't get to argue about where they'll give birth. So you watch the men work, and you help where you can, and you learn how to turn a clearing in the forest into something resembling a home. The cabin rises slowly, log by log. It's not large, no frontier cabin is, but it's solid. One room, a fireplace for heat and cooking, a loft space where children will sleep when they're old enough to climb a ladder. The spaces between the logs are filled with mud and moss, stuffed into gaps to keep wind and cold and animals out. The floor is packed dirt, hard as stone in summer, frozen in winter, impossible to keep truly clean. There's no well yet. You'll carry water from the creek, hauling buckets that weigh more than you think you can lift. You're doing it anyway because water isn't optional. There are no glass windows. You'll use greased paper, which lets in light but not much else. Certainly not a view of anything beyond vague shapes and shadows. You give birth to Mary Amelia on January 10th, 1865. 5 years to the day after your wedding, almost exactly. She's born in this cabin with a midwife from a neighbouring family and your mother-in-law's help, because Charles can't do anything useful during labour, except pace and worry and stay out of the way. The labour lasts hours, hours of pain that splits you open, pain that makes you understand why women die doing this, why childbirth is one of the leading causes of death for young women, why the graveyards are full of women in their 20s who bled out or got infections or had babies that wouldn't come. But you survive. Mary survives. She's healthy, strong-lunged, with her father's light hair and a steady gaze that reminds you of your own mother. You hold her in the dim cabin, exhausted beyond anything you've ever felt, and you feel two things simultaneously: overwhelming love and absolute terror, because now there's someone who depends entirely on you, someone who'll starve if you can't feed her, freeze if you can't keep her warm, die if you can't protect her. The responsibility is crushing, and it will never end, and you accept it anyway because that's what mothers do. 2 years later, on February 7th, 1867, Laura Elizabeth is born. Another winter birth, another labour that feels like it might kill you but doesn't. Another baby girl who looks up at you with eyes that don't know yet how hard this life is going to be. Charles is disappointed, though he tries to hide it. He wanted a son. Sons can help with heavy work, can take over a farm eventually, can carry on a name. Daughters are beloved, yes, but they're also going to leave when they marry, and the investment of raising them goes to someone else's family. You don't care. You look at Mary and Laura, your two daughters, and you see something Charles doesn't. You see resilience. You see the strength they'll need. You see yourself at 5 years old, learning that the world is brutal and unfair, and you survive it anyway. Life in the big woods settles into a rhythm governed by seasons. Spring means planting, tapping maple trees for sugar, cleaning the cabin after a winter of being sealed inside with smoke and bodies and the smell of unwashed wool. Summer means tending the garden, preserving everything you can, preparing for the winter you know is coming. Fall means harvest, hunting, smoking meat, storing root vegetables in the cellar Charles dug by hand. Winter means survival, rationing food, keeping the fire going, staying alive until spring returns, and through it all, you work. Here's what nobody tells you about being a pioneer woman. The work never ends, and nobody calls it work. You wake before dawn because the fire needs tending and breakfast needs making and children need feeding, before Charles heads out to hunt or farm or cut timber. You cook every meal from scratch, over a fireplace that requires constant attention, using ingredients that are never guaranteed. Bread from flour you've ground yourself. Meat from animals Charles has killed and you've butchered. Vegetables from a garden you've planted and weeded and harvested while pregnant or nursing or both. You make all the family's clothing, all of it. From spinning the wool or weaving the flax to cutting and sewing each garment by hand. Mary needs a dress. Laura needs stockings. Charles needs a shirt. Carrie, born December 1st, 1869, your third daughter, needs everything because babies grow faster than you can sew. You preserve food, salting meat, smoking fish, drying berries, making cheese, churning butter. You can't go to a store and buy these things. You make them or you do without, and doing without means hunger, and hunger means weakness, and weakness on the frontier can mean death. You bear children and nurse them and teach them and keep them clean and safe and fed. You manage the household accounts, such as they are. You tend the sick when illness comes, and illness always comes. Fevers, infections, injuries, the 100 small disasters that happen when you live miles from a doctor. Your work is the foundation that makes everything else possible. Charles can hunt because you've made his clothes and packed his food. The children can play because you fed them and kept them warm. The family can survive because you never stop working. And nobody calls it work. It's just what women do. It's invisible labour, unrecorded and uncompensated, taken for granted because it happens every single day without fail. Charles works hard too. You won't deny that. He hunts, bringing home venison and rabbits, and occasionally something larger. A bear once, which feeds the family for weeks and provides fat for cooking and fur for warmth. He plants and harvests wheat, though the crop is always uncertain, always dependent on weather and luck. He cuts timber, builds furniture, repairs the cabin when winter damage reveals itself in spring. And in the evenings, when the work is finally done and the children are fed and the fire is banked for the night, he plays his fiddle. The cabin fills with music. The Arkansas Traveler, Money Musk, Pop Goes the Weasel, and Mary and Laura dance, their small bodies twirling in the firelight, and you let yourself believe that this is enough. That this life you're building, hard as it is worth the cost. The big woods years are good years, relatively speaking. You have food most of the time. The children are healthy. Charles isn't talking about moving yet, though you can see the restlessness building in him like pressure behind a dam. He listens too carefully when men at church talk about land opening up farther west. He reads the newspaper advertisements about free homesteads under the new Homestead Act. He talks about opportunity and fresh starts and building something bigger. You don't say much when he talks like this. You've learned that arguing with Charles when he's got an idea in his head is like arguing with the weather. It doesn't change anything, and it only exhausts you. So you nod and smile and keep your hands busy with mending or knitting or one of the 1,000 tasks that fill your days, and you hope that maybe this time he'll be content to stay put. But Charles is never content to stay put. By 1869, the conversations about moving west are no longer hypothetical. They're plans. Charles has heard about land in Kansas, about the Osage Diminished Reserve being open for settlement, about opportunity for families willing to take the risk. He's sold on the idea before he's even convinced you, and you know from experience that once Charles has decided something, the decision is made. You look at your 3 daughters, Mary at 4 years old, Laura at 2, Carrie still nursing, and you think about uprooting them from the only home they've known. You think about leaving the big woods, leaving the neighbours you've finally gotten to know, leaving the cabin you've worked so hard to make livable. You think about your mother, widowed at 30 with 6 children, and how she survived by accepting help and remarrying and staying in one place long enough to build something stable. And then you look at Charles, your husband for 9 years now, the man who promised you a home and stability and a future built together, and you pack your belongings. Again. Because that's what wives do. It's 1868, and Charles is making the decision that will define the next decade of your life, though you don't know it yet. He's selling the Wisconsin land. The Big Woods property, the cabin you've made into a home, the cleared fields where he's planted wheat, the garden where you've grown vegetables to keep your children fed, all of it is going to a Swedish settler named Gustaf Gustafsson for $1,012.50. He won't get all that money at once. It'll come in installments, payments spread across years. A financial arrangement that sounds reasonable until you realise it means Charles won't wait for the full amount before he moves you west. He's already decided where you're going and why you need to leave now, before doubt creeps in, before Caroline can say all the things she's thinking but won't say out loud. Kansas, that's the destination. Kansas Territory, where land is opening up under the Homestead Act of 1862, where the government promises 160 acres free to anyone willing to work it for 5 years. Charles has heard the rumours carried by other restless men at church and town gatherings. If you get there early and stake your claim, you'll be first in line when the land becomes legal to homestead. What he doesn't tell you, what he maybe doesn't even admit to himself, is that the land isn't actually available yet. The Osage people still own it. The government is negotiating to take it from them, but treaties haven't been finalised, land hasn't been surveyed, nothing is legally open for settlement. But Charles doesn't think about that. Or if he does, he pushes it down the same way you push down your own fears, because acknowledging the moral weight of what you're about to do means facing something neither of you is ready to face. So in May 1868, you watch him load the wagon with everything you own, which still isn't much after 8 years of marriage. Your dishes, wrapped carefully in quilts you've sewn from scraps. The tools he uses for carpentry and hunting. The fiddle, always the fiddle, tucked in a place where it won't get damaged. And your daughters, Mary at 3 years old and Laura barely 1, too young to understand what's happening but old enough to sense that something big is changing. The journey west takes weeks, through Wisconsin, into Iowa, across Missouri into Kansas Territory. The wagon creaks over roads that aren't really roads, just ruts worn into the prairie by previous travellers. Mary and Laura sleep in the wagon bed at night, their small bodies curled together, while you and Charles lie beneath the wagon on bedrolls, listening to the sounds of the prairie, wind that never stops, coyotes howling in the distance, sometimes the deeper, more unsettling sound of wolves. The landscape changes as you travel. The dense forests of Wisconsin give way to scattered groves, then to open prairie, and grass that grows so tall it brushes your waist when you walk through it. The sky gets bigger here, stretching from horizon to horizon without trees to break it up, and at night the stars are so bright and numerous they look like someone spilled salt across black velvet. You arrive in Montgomery County, Kansas in late summer or early fall of 1868. Charles finds a spot on the Osage Diminished Reserve and starts building another cabin. This one is similar to the Wisconsin cabin, logs chinked with mud, a fireplace, packed dirt floor, but the isolation is different. In Wisconsin, you had neighbours within walking distance. Here the nearest family is miles away, and the town of Independence, where you'll buy supplies, is a journey that takes planning. The Osage people are still here. You see them sometimes, passing through on their way to traditional hunting grounds, moving across land that has been theirs for generations. Charles tells you not to worry, that they're peaceful, that the treaty will go through soon, and everything will be legal. But you worry anyway, because you're a woman alone with 2 small children when Charles goes hunting or travelling to town, and because deep in your bones you know that you're living on land that doesn't belong to you, that hasn't been given to you, that you're taking without permission or right. Charles builds the cabin through the fall and winter. It's crude, even by frontier standards. 3 walls of logs and 1 wall made of sod, no floor except packed earth. A hole in the roof for smoke because proper chimneys require more time and materials than Charles has. But it's shelter. And shelter is what you need before the real Kansas winter arrives. You make it work. You always make it work. You hang a quilt to divide the single room into sleeping areas. You scrub the dirt floor until it's as clean as dirt can be. You cook over an open fire pit until Charles can build a proper fireplace. You keep the children warm and fed and safe, and you try not to think about how much better the Big Woods cabin was, how much more stable your life was just 6 months ago. And then, on August 3rd, 1870, you give birth to your 4th child, another girl. You name her Caroline Celestia, Carrie for short, after yourself and Charles's mother. Carrie is born on Osage land, in a cabin that stands on territory that hasn't been legally transferred, making her arrival symbolic in ways you won't understand for years. Another generation of settlers putting down roots in soil that doesn't belong to them. You hold your newborn daughter in the crude Kansas cabin, and you feel the weight of what you've done. You've followed Charles across hundreds of miles. You've left security for uncertainty. You've chosen this man and this life over the independence you once valued so highly. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and the love and the bone-deep commitment to making this work, a small voice whispers a question you'll never speak aloud. What have I done? The Kansas cabin never becomes a home, because you're living on stolen time. It's spring 1871, and you've been on the Osage Diminished Reserve for nearly 2 years now. Carrie is a year old, toddling around the cabin on unsteady legs. Laura is 4, Mary is 6, and they're both old enough to sense the tension that's been building in Charles like a storm you can't see but know is coming. The land is beautiful. You'll admit that. The prairie stretches endlessly, grass so tall it hides the children when they play. The sky is bigger here than anywhere you've ever lived, and at night the stars are so close you feel like you could reach up and touch them. Charles talks about the crops he'll plant, the livestock he'll raise, the future he's building for his daughters, but you know something Charles doesn't want to admit. You're not building anything. You're trespassing. The Osage people still own this land. The government is negotiating to buy it from them. Negotiating, not completed, not finalised, not legal. You and Charles and the 500 and other white families who've moved onto the reserve are squatters, living on land that doesn't belong to you, gambling that the government will take it from the Osage before someone forces you to leave. You see the Osage families sometimes travelling through on their traditional routes, hunting on land their ancestors have walked for generations. Some of them stop near your cabin. They look at the walls Charles has built, the garden you've planted, the visible marks of occupation, and their faces show something you recognise because you felt it yourself. The helpless anger of watching someone take what's yours and knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. Charles tells you not to worry. He says the treaty will go through any day now, that the land will be surveyed and open for preemption, that you'll be able to buy your 160 acres for $1.25 per acre, and everything will be legal and proper. But Charles doesn't have $200. You know this. He barely had enough to move the family here and build this crude cabin. The money from selling the Wisconsin land is coming in installments, and most of it's already spent on supplies and tools and the 1,000 things a family needs to survive. The rumours start in early 1871. Soldiers might be coming to remove the white settlers. The Osage Treaty negotiations are falling apart. The government might enforce removal before the land sale happens. Men at the trading post in Independence talk in low voices about what they'll do if soldiers show up. Whether they'll fight, whether they'll run, whether they'll wait and risk everything. Charles makes the decision before you even know he's considering it. In late spring 1871, he tells you you're leaving. Not because soldiers are forcing you out. They haven't arrived yet. Not because the government is ordering removal. That's still just rumour. But because Charles has finally done the math and realised what you already knew. He can't afford to buy this land even if it becomes available. He frames it differently, of course. He talks about opportunity elsewhere, about getting back to family in Wisconsin, about the letter from the man who bought your Pepin property saying he can't make the payments and asking you to take the land back. He makes it sound like a choice, like strategy, like forward thinking. But you see what it really is. Charles running from another failure. Moving before he has to admit that this whole Kansas adventure was a mistake from the start, that you spent 2 years building on land you could never keep, that you uprooted your family for nothing. You pack your belongings, again. You load the wagon, again. You wake your daughters before dawn and tell them to be quiet while Charles hitches the horses, because leaving early means fewer questions from neighbours, fewer admissions of defeat. As you ride away from the Kansas cabin, you look back once. It's still standing there, 3 walls of logs and 1 wall of sod, the first home you tried to build in the West. By next year, another family will be living in it. A family who stayed, who could afford to buy the land, who didn't run at the first sign of difficulty. You're 21 years old, and you've already learned that home is a temporary thing when you're married to Charles Ingalls. But you don't know yet that Kansas is just the first failure. You don't know yet that the real disasters are still ahead, that the grasshoppers are already laying eggs in the Minnesota soil, That in 3 years you'll watch the sky turn dark with insects that will eat everything you've worked for in a single afternoon. You don't know yet that your next son will be born and die before his first birthday, that you'll flee a town in the middle of the night to escape debts Charles can't pay, that the next decade will break something in you that never quite heals. All you know right now is that you're leaving Kansas, heading back to Wisconsin, and Charles is already talking about the next place, the next opportunity, the next horizon that's always just a little farther west. You don't stay in Wisconsin long. By 1870, Charles is restless again, and this time the destination is Minnesota, Walnut Grove in Redwood County, where land is being opened for homesteading and the soil is rich and black and supposedly perfect for wheat. You want to argue. You want to remind him that you've moved 4 times in 10 years, that Mary and Laura need stability, that maybe, just maybe, staying in one place might be the better strategy. But you don't argue, because you've learned that arguing with Charles about moving west is like arguing with a river about which way it flows. So you pack your belongings, again, and you follow him to Minnesota. The Walnut Grove area is beautiful in a different way than Kansas. There are trees here, cottonwoods and willows along Plum Creek, and the land rolls gently instead of stretching flat to the horizon. Charles files a homestead claim and builds yet another cabin, this one better than the Kansas place, with actual walls and a proper roof and a dugout section built into a hillside for extra protection from the brutal Minnesota winters. For a while it works. For a precious few years it actually seems like Charles might have been right, like this might be the place where you finally put down roots and stop moving. Charles plants wheat. The crop comes in. You have food, actual abundance instead of the constant rationing you've grown used to. The girls are healthy. Mary at 7 is already reading everything she can get her hands on. Laura at 5 is wild and curious, climbing trees and wading in the creek and asking questions about everything she sees. On November 1st, 1875, you give birth to your 4th child. A boy, finally. You name him Charles Frederick, Freddie for short, and when Charles holds his son for the first time, you see something in his face you haven't seen in years. Hope that maybe this boy will grow up to take over the farm, that maybe this means you're really settling here. Freddie is small, smaller than your girls were as newborns. He struggles to gain weight. He cries more than a healthy baby should, and sometimes his little body convulses in ways that make your chest tight with fear. You tell yourself he'll grow stronger, that many babies start fragile and become hardy, that you're worrying over nothing. But in the back of your mind, you remember the frontier graveyard in Pepin, the rows of small stones marking babies who didn't survive their first year. You remember women at church gatherings talking in low voices about children they'd lost, about how you learn not to get too attached until a baby makes it past 2 years old. You remember your own mother telling you once that every mother lives with the constant gnawing fear that this time death will come for one of your children, and there won't be anything you can do to stop it. The summer of 1874 starts well. Charles's wheat crop is looking strong, the best he's ever planted. You're already planning how you'll use the money from the harvest. New dresses for the girls, maybe a glass window for the cabin, some saved for winter supplies. For once. You let yourself relax into the possibility that things might actually work out. And then, on a July afternoon, the sky goes dark. Not with storm clouds, with grasshoppers. They come from the west in a cloud so thick it blocks the sun. Millions of them. Billions. More insects than you've ever seen. More than you could imagine existing in one place. The sound is overwhelming. A clicking, buzzing roar that drowns out everything else, like standing next to a waterfall made of chitin and wings. They land in the wheat field first. Charles runs out with a broom, trying to sweep them away, trying to protect his crop. But you can't sweep away billions of grasshoppers. They cover every surface. The wheat, the garden, the cabin walls, the ground. They're so thick on the roof you can hear them chewing through the wood. So within hours the wheat is gone, not damaged, gone, eaten down to stubble. The grasshoppers move to your garden next. They eat the potatoes, the beans, the carrots you planted in careful rows. They eat the bark off the trees. They eat the curtains when they get inside the house. They eat the wool off the sheep. They eat the handles of the tools because they like the taste of the salt from human sweat. You stand in the doorway holding baby Freddie, watching Charles walk through what used to be his wheat field, and you see his shoulders slump in a way that tells you everything you need to know. It's gone. A year's worth of work, destroyed in an afternoon. You have no crop to sell, no way to pay for winter supplies, no harvest to see you through until spring. And the grasshoppers are still here, eating everything, laying eggs in the soil for next year's devastation. This is the moment everything changes. Freddie dies on August 27th, 1876, 9 months and 26 days after he was born. You know it's coming. You've known for weeks that he's failing, that his small body is losing the fight. The convulsions are getting worse. He can't keep food down. He cries in a way that sounds less like hunger and more like pain, a thin wail that cuts through you every time you hear it. The doctor comes, but there's nothing he can do. Medicine on the frontier in 1876 consists mostly of guesswork and hope. Whatever is wrong with Freddie, some kind of seizure disorder maybe, or a developmental problem, or an infection that's ravaging his tiny body, it's beyond the doctor's ability to treat. Charles holds Freddie while you cook dinner for Mary, Laura, and Carrie. Later, Caroline Ingalls will say, "Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived." But Freddie doesn't live. He dies in Charles's arms on a late August afternoon, and you bury him on Peter Ingalls' farm, Charles's brother's land, because you don't have your own land to bury your son on. There's no stone. You can't afford a stone. You mark the spot with a wooden cross that will rot and disappear within a few years, and you walk away from your infant son's grave knowing that when the spring floods come, when the Zumbro River overflows its banks, his resting place will be washed away and you'll never be able to find it again. The grasshoppers come back in 1875. They come back in 1876. Everything Charles plants gets destroyed before it can be harvested. You're living on credit now, borrowing from the store, promising to pay when the crop comes in, knowing the crop isn't coming in but lying anyway because the alternative is starvation. Charles takes wage work when he can find it. He leaves you alone with 3 daughters and a dying baby, walking to railroad camps or timber operations, doing manual labour for $1 a day. The money helps, but it's not enough, and it's never going to be enough. And then William Stedman, an acquaintance from Walnut Grove, writes with an offer. He's bought a hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, the Masters Hotel, and he needs help running it. There's room for the Ingalls family. There's regular work. There's a chance to start over somewhere the grasshoppers haven't destroyed everything. Charles accepts before asking if you want to go. You pack your belongings. Fewer now. Because you've sold things to buy food, and you load the wagon. Freddie dies during the journey or just before it. The timing's unclear because loss blurs together when you're grieving, while also trying to keep your living children fed. You arrive in Burr Oak in fall 1876. The hotel is larger than any place you've lived, 3 stories tall, with 11 rooms and a basement kitchen, and a saloon room that makes you uncomfortable because you've seen what alcohol does to men with no money and too much desperation. Charles works the grinding mill in partnership with a local man. You help with the hotel, cooking for guests, cleaning rooms, managing the business alongside the Stedmans. It's hard work, but it's steady, and for a few months you let yourself believe that maybe this is the answer. Maybe hotel keeping is what Charles should have been doing all along instead of trying to farm. But the hotel business is slow. Burr Oak is past its boom years. The flood of settlers moving through has slowed to a trickle. There aren't enough guests to sustain 2 hotels in a town this small. By early 1877, the Stedmans are talking about selling, and Charles's mill partnership isn't bringing in enough money to cover your debts. The debts. You didn't know about all of them until it was too late. Charles has been borrowing, from the store, from other settlers, from anyone who would extend credit to a family that's lost 2 harvests to grasshoppers and an infant son to illness. He's been promising to pay when things get better, but things aren't getting better. One night in early 1877, Charles comes to you with a decision already made. You're leaving, tonight, in the dark. Before anyone realizes you're going. You understand what this means. You're running from debts. You're fleeing in the night like criminals, leaving people you owe money to without warning or payment. This isn't migration-seeking opportunity. This is escape, and it comes with shame that tastes like copper in your mouth. But what choice do you have? Charles has no way to pay what he owes. If you stay, you'll be taken to court, possibly jailed, certainly humiliated. The children will suffer, so you pack your belongings, what's left of them, in silence. You wake Mary, Laura and Carrie in the dark and tell them to be quiet, absolutely silent, while Charles loads the wagon by moonlight. You leave Burr Oak the way criminals leave, in the middle of the night, without goodbyes, without paying your debts, without dignity. You're 27 years old. You've been married for 17 years. You've moved 8 times. You've lost a son. You've watched grasshoppers destroy 2 years of crops. You fled a town in the dark to avoid legal consequences. And Charles is already talking about the next place, De Smet, South Dakota, where there's a railroad boom, where land is opening up, where surely this time things will be different. You don't say anything. You sit in the wagon holding Carrie, with Mary and Laura huddled under blankets behind you, and you watch Burr Oak disappear into the darkness. And you think about your mother, widowed at 30, who survived by staying in one place and building a life from the rubble. You think about your father, who drowned chasing opportunity across Lake Michigan. You think about the choice you made at 20 years old to marry a man with restless eyes and a fiddle and promises about the future. And you wonder, for the first time, if you made the wrong choice. You return to Walnut Grove in spring 1877 with less than you left with. The midnight flight from Burr Oak has cost you more than money. It's cost you reputation. Word travels in small frontier towns, and people remember families who run from debts. When you arrive back in Minnesota, faces that used to be friendly are now careful, guarded, watching to see if Charles Ingalls will stay this time, or disappear again when things get difficult. Charles finds work as a day labourer, not farming his own land. You don't have land anymore. Working other men's fields. Doing the kind of manual labour that pays enough to eat but not enough to save. He's 38 years old now, and you can see it wearing on him. The realisation that he's no closer to success than he was at 25, that every choice he's made has led you further from security instead of toward it. You take in boarders when you can. You do washing and mending for families who can afford to pay. You're pregnant again, and you're too tired to feel anything about it except the dull acceptance that this is your life now. Moving, working, surviving, never quite making it out of poverty. On May 23rd, 1877, you give birth to your 5th child in a small rented room in Walnut Grove. Another girl. You name her Grace Pearl, and when you hold her for the first time, you think about Freddie, your son who died less than a year ago, whose grave you'll never see again because it's on Peter Ingalls' farm and Peter's moved and you don't even know if the marker is still standing. Grace is healthy in a way Freddie never was. She nurses well, gains weight, doesn't have the convulsions that plagued your son. You should feel relieved, grateful, but mostly you just feel exhausted. You're 37 years old with 5 daughters, Mary at 12, Laura at 10, Carrie at 7, and now Grace, a newborn who needs you every few hours through the night. Mary is your hope. You watch her read everything she can find, watch her help teach Laura and Carrie, watch her dream about becoming a teacher herself. She's brilliant, your oldest daughter, the one who might actually escape the cycle of poverty and migration that's defined your family. She's talking about normal school, about getting training to teach, and you let yourself imagine a future where at least one of your children doesn't spend her life running from one failed homestead to the next. Charles is talking about leaving again. Of course he is. He's heard about the railroad boom in Dakota Territory, about the town of De Smet being built where the Chicago and Northwestern Railway is pushing through. There's work there, he says. Real work, steady wages working for the railroad, and then later, when the town is established, there will be homestead land available, and you can finally prove up a claim and have something permanent. You don't argue anymore. What would be the point? Charles is going to move west, whether you agree or not. And maybe he's right. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe De Smet will be the place where you finally stop running. But before you can leave, Before you can pack your belongings one more time and load another wagon and follow Charles toward another horizon, something happens that changes everything. Mary gets sick. It starts in early spring 1879, just as you're preparing to leave for Dakota Territory. A fever, high and sudden, that makes Mary's skin burn to the touch. She complains of a headache, severe pain behind her eyes. She can't bear light. She vomits. She drifts in and out of consciousness, and when she's awake, she doesn't always recognize where she is. You've seen fevers before. You've nursed your children through illnesses, but this is different. This is worse. Mary's neck is stiff. Her body convulses. One side of her face droops. The muscles paralyzed by whatever is ravaging her nervous system. The doctor comes. He examines Mary carefully, his face grave, and he tells you what you already suspect. This is serious. Very serious. Brain fever, he calls it, though the medical term doesn't matter as much as the prognosis. Most children survive this kind of fever, he says, but there can be complications. You sit beside Mary's bed for days. You press cool cloths to her forehead. You hold her hand. You pray harder than you've prayed since your father drowned in Lake Michigan 34 years ago, and you make bargains with God. Take anything else. Take the house. Take the money. Take your own health. Just let Mary recover. Just let her live. The fever breaks after nearly a week. Mary wakes weak, confused, siao, soaked in sweat that's drenched the sheets you've changed a dozen times. She's alive, and for a moment you let yourself believe that's enough, that you've been spared the worst. And then Mary says something that stops your heart. Ma, why is it so dark? Your hand freezes on Mary's forehead. It's not dark, sweetheart, you say carefully, your voice steady even though everything inside you is crumbling. It's morning. The sun's been up for hours. But I can't see it, Mary says, and there's fear in her voice now, rising panic that you recognize because you feel it too, a terror so complete it's hard to breathe. Everything's dark, Ma. I can't see. The world tilts sideways. You hear yourself saying calm words, telling Mary not to worry, telling her it's probably temporary, the fever affecting her eyes, for it will get better. But underneath the calm words, something inside you is screaming. The doctor comes back. He examines Mary's eyes again, this time spending longer, looking more carefully, his expression getting heavier with each passing moment. Finally, he pulls you and Charles aside into the main room, away from where Mary can hear. The fever damaged her optic nerves, he explains quietly. I've seen it before with this type of illness. The inflammation attacked the nerves that carry visual information from the eyes to the brain. You already know what he's going to say next. You can see it in his face, in the way he won't quite meet your eyes. Is there any chance the blindness is temporary? Charles asks. And you can hear the desperation in his voice. The same desperation you feel but can't let yourself show, because if you start showing it, you'll fall apart completely. The doctor's silence is answer enough. Then he says, I've seen a few cases where partial vision returned, but in most cases, when the damage is this severe... He doesn't finish the sentence, he doesn't need to. Mary Ingalls, 14 years old, top of her class, the daughter who was going to be a teacher, is blind. Permanently, irrevocably blind. And you, Caroline Ingalls, who has survived everything life has thrown at you. Poverty, displacement, infant death, shame, exhaustion. You stand there and you feel something crack inside you that you don't know how to fix. Mary takes the news with a composure that breaks your heart more than screaming would. She's 14 years old, and she's just lost the world she knew, and she sits in her bed and she nods and she says, all right, just that, all right, like she's accepting something ordinary instead of something that will shape every moment of the rest of her life. Laura cries, Carrie cries. Grace is too young to understand, but she senses the grief in the house and clings to your skirts, whimpering. You don't cry. You can't. If you start, you're afraid you won't stop, afraid the grief will split you open and everything inside will spill out and you'll never be able to gather it back together. Instead, you do what you always do. You work. Mary needs to learn to navigate the house without sight. You start teaching her immediately, before she has time to become helpless, before she learns to be dependent. You guide her hand along the walls, teaching her to count steps, to recognize rooms by sound and smell, and the feel of the floorboards under her feet. She needs to learn to dress herself, to braid her own hair, to do the domestic tasks that will be expected of her, even though she can't see. You work with her patiently, showing her how to use touch where she once used sight, how to fold fabric so the seams tell her which side is which, how to feel the heat of the stove to know if it's safe to approach. And she needs education. That's the hardest part, the part that makes you want to rage at the unfairness of a world where a brilliant girl loses her chance at independence because her optic nerves died. In rural Minnesota in 1879, there are no schools for blind children nearby, no resources, no training. Just Mary, sitting in darkness, while other girls her age continue their studies. Charles is still talking about moving to De Smet. The railroad job is waiting. The homestead opportunity is real. And maybe, he suggests quietly, maybe in a bigger town near a railroad line, there might be more options for Mary. Maybe there's a school somewhere, training somewhere, something that could help her. You don't want to move. You're so tired of moving. But what choice do you have? Staying in Walnut Grove means Mary sits in a small rented room for the rest of her life, with no future, no education, no hope of anything beyond being a burden her family has to carry. So in fall 1879, you pack your belongings again. You load the wagon again. You help Mary climb up, guiding her hands to the seat, teaching her where to hold on, and watching her face as she sits in darkness while the rest of you can see the Minnesota countryside rolling past. And you head west one more time, toward Dakota Territory, toward De Smet, toward what Charles promises will be your final home. You don't believe him anymore, but you go anyway. You arrive in De Smet in October 1879 and the town barely exists. It's not a settlement, it's a construction camp. A few buildings thrown up along the railroad line, canvas tents, temporary structures that will blow away in the first real storm. The railroad company is building west from Minnesota, laying tracks through Dakota Territory, and De Smet is one of the depot towns being established every 7 miles or so along the line. Charles gets work immediately as a railroad carpenter, earning steady wages for the first time in years. It's not homesteading, not farming, but it's reliable. And after the disasters of the past decade, reliable feels like luxury. You live in a surveyor's house for the winter, a proper building with walls and a floor and windows, because the railroad needs the surveyor's house occupied to establish it as a permanent structure for legal purposes. It's the best housing you've had in years. There's room for all 5 girls. There's a school where Laura can attend, and where Mary can sit in the back and listen, learning by sound what she can no longer read. There's a community forming, other families drawn by the railroad, by the homestead opportunities that will open up once the land is surveyed. For a few months, you let yourself believe that maybe Charles was right. Maybe De Smet will be different. And maybe this is where you finally stop running and start building something that lasts. And then winter comes. The winter of 1880 to 1881 will later be called the Long Winter, and the name doesn't capture even half of how terrible it is. It starts early in October, with a blizzard that doesn't stop for 3 days, and then another blizzard, and another. Between October and May, there are only a few days when the wind stops howling, and you can see more than a few feet beyond your door. The trains stop running in November. The railroad can't keep the tracks clear. The snow drifts too fast, too deep, sometimes 20 feet high, in places where the wind piles it up. No trains means no supplies, no coal for heating, no flour for bread, no food coming in from outside. The town is cut off. You're trapped in a half-built settlement on the Dakota Prairie with 100 other people and no way to get supplies until spring. Charles and a young man named Cap Garland make a dangerous trip south to find wheat from a settler who has seed wheat stored. They risk their lives in a blizzard to bring back 60 pounds of wheat that has to feed your family and several others for weeks. You grind it in a coffee mill, a few tablespoons at a time, because there's no grist mill and no way to grind it except by hand. The grinding becomes your life. Turn the handle, feel the wheat crack and crumble, collect the rough flour in a bowl, Do it again and again and again. Your hands blister, then callous, then go numb from the repetitive motion. You make bread from the flour that's barely ground fine enough to bake, and bread that's dark and coarse and tastes like desperation. The fuel runs out. You burn twisted hay for heat, hay that Charles and Laura twist together into tight bundles that burn hot and fast and have to be constantly replaced. The house is never warm. You wrap the children in every piece of clothing you own, every quilt and blanket, and still you can see their breath in the air inside the house. Mary sits by the stove, her hands on Grace to keep the baby warm. She can't help twist hay because she can't see to do it properly. She can't help grind wheat because the coffee mill requires precision she doesn't have. So she holds Grace, hour after hour, keeping your youngest child from freezing while you work yourself into exhaustion trying to keep everyone alive. On December 1st, 1880, in the middle of this nightmare winter, Grace turns 3 years old. You don't celebrate. You don't have anything to celebrate with. You save a tiny piece of bread for her, slightly less coarse than the rest, and you sing Happy Birthday, while the wind screams outside and the hay fire burns down and the darkness presses in from all sides. There are days you think you're going to die, days when the wheat is almost gone and the hay is running low, and you can't see how you're going to survive until morning, let alone until spring. Days when you look at your 5 daughters, Mary blind at 15, Laura at 13 doing the work of an adult, Carrie at 11 too thin and too quiet, Grace at 3 not understanding why there's never enough food, and you wonder what you've done. What choices brought you to this place where your children might starve or freeze because Charles Ingalls couldn't stay put in Wisconsin? But you don't die. None of you die. You grind wheat and twist hay and ration food and burn furniture when the hay runs out. You survive because Caroline Ingalls doesn't know how to do anything else. You survive because quitting means your children die, and you will gnaw your own arm off before you let your children die. In May 1881, the train finally breaks through. The whistle sounds across the prairie, and people pour out of their houses and run to the depot, crying and laughing and shouting. Supplies arrive, food, real food, flour that's already ground, potatoes, salt pork, luxuries you've gone without for 7 months. You stand at the depot with Grace in your arms and Mary beside you, her hand on your shoulder so she knows where you are, and you watch Charles unload supplies with the kind of savage relief that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. You're 41 years old. You've been married for 21 years. You've moved more than 10 times. You've lost a son. You've watched your oldest daughter go blind. You've survived a winter that killed cattle and broke families and drove some people mad. And Charles is smiling. Actually smiling. Because the Homestead land is about to open up for filing, and he's planning to claim 160 acres. And surely this time, it will work out. You look at him, this man you married at 20, and you realise something you've maybe always known but never admitted. Charles Ingalls will never stop chasing horizons. He will never be satisfied. He will never build something permanent because permanence terrifies him more than poverty ever could. And you're tied to him until death parts you, because that's what the marriage vows meant. Because divorce would leave you destitute with 5 daughters to support, because you have no choice. So you nod when he talks about the homestead claim. You smile when he describes the land he wants to file on. You pack your belongings one more time and move out of the surveyor's house and into a small shanty on the claim he's filed. And you start over. Again. It's 1881, and you're watching your blind daughter prepare to leave home for the first time in her life. Rosanne Mary is 16 years old. She's been blind for 2 years now. 2 years of learning to navigate a world she can't see. 2 years of sitting in the de Smet cabin while her sisters go to school and socials, and all the normal activities that teenage girls do. 2 years of being dependent, being limited, being the one who needs help instead of giving it. And then a travelling missionary stops in de Smet and tells you about the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton. A real school with teachers trained to work with blind students, with courses in academics and music and practical skills. A place where Mary could learn to read raised print, could study subjects she's been hungry for since the fever took her sight. The tuition is expensive, far more than your family can afford, but Charles applies for a scholarship. The church congregation raises money. You take in extra sewing, extra washing, selling every hour of labour you have to spare, and somehow, miraculously, you scrape together enough to send Mary to Iowa. On November 23rd, 1881, you put your oldest daughter on a train heading east, away from you to a place she's never been, where she'll live with strangers and learn to be independent in ways you never imagined possible. You stand on the platform watching the train disappear, and something inside you breaks open. Pride and grief and fear all mixed together until you can't tell them apart. Pride that Mary is brave enough to do this. Grief that your blind daughter has to leave home to get an education. Fear that something will happen to her and you won't be there to help. Laura is 14 now, teaching school herself during the winter terms to earn money for Mary's tuition. Your second daughter, the wild one who used to climb trees and wade in creeks, is standing in front of a classroom full of children and teaching them to read. She's barely older than some of her students, but she's competent, capable, earning wages that go straight to keeping Mary at the Iowa College for the Blind. You watch Laura leave each Monday morning to stay at whatever claim family needs a teacher that term, and you feel the weight of it. How much your daughters are sacrificing, how early they've had to grow up, how childhood ended for them somewhere back in the Grasshopper years and never quite returned. Carrie is 12, Grace is 4, and you're 42 years old. You've been married for 21 years. You've moved more times than you can count. You've lost a son, watched a daughter go blind, survived a winter that should have killed you. And Charles is finally talking about staying put. The Des Met Homestead claim is Charles's most successful attempt at proving up. He files the final papers in 1886, pays the $16 filing fee, and for the first time in your married life, you own land. Not much, 157 acres, but it's yours, legal and official. It should feel like victory. It should feel like all those years of moving and failing and starting over were leading to this moment. But mostly it just feels like exhaustion, like arriving at a destination you're too tired to care about anymore. And then Laura comes home one Sunday afternoon with news that makes your chest tight. She's been courting. A young man named Almanzo Wilder, 10 years older than her, a farmer with his own claim north of town. He's been driving her to and from her teaching positions, taking her for buggy rides, and somewhere along the way, courtship turned into something more serious. He's asked her to marry him. She said yes. You look at your daughter, 18 years old, barely grown, still teaching to pay for Mary's schooling, and you want to tell her to wait. You want to tell her that marriage is harder than she thinks, that choosing a farmer means choosing uncertainty, that love isn't always enough when crops fail and babies die and your husband drags you across 4 states, chasing dreams that never materialize. But you don't say any of that, because Laura's looking at you with hope in her eyes, and because she's already made her choice, and because maybe, just maybe, her story will be different than yours. On August 25th, 1885, Laura Elizabeth Ingalls marries Almanzo James Wilder in Des Met, South Dakota. Reverend Edward Brown performs the ceremony. Laura refuses to say, obey, in her vows. I cannot make a promise that I will not keep, she tells Almanzo, and he agrees because he loves her enough to let her be herself. You watch your daughter get married, and you think about your own wedding 25 years ago. You were 20 years old, full of hope, believing that love and hard work could overcome anything. Now you're 45, and you know better. You know that love isn't always enough, that hard work doesn't guarantee success, that the best you can hope for is to survive with most of yourself intact. But you smile for Laura. Thus you help her pack her belongings. You send her off to Almanzo's claim with blessings and quilts and all the practical knowledge you've accumulated from 2 decades of making do with nothing. And then she's gone, and you're left with 3 daughters instead of 4, and the house feels emptier than it should. Laura's first few years of marriage are brutal, and you watch from Des Met feeling like you're reliving your own worst nightmares. Their daughter Rose is born December 5th, 1886, a year after the wedding. You become a grandmother at 47, and you should feel joy, but mostly you feel fear because you know how hard it is to raise a baby when you're poor and farming, and nothing ever quite works out the way you planned. And then everything starts falling apart for Laura and Almanzo the same way it fell apart for you and Charles. Drought comes, their wheat crops fail. Almanzo gets diphtheria and survives, but the disease leaves him partially paralysed, his legs weakened in ways that never fully heal. He can walk, but not well. He can work, but not the way he used to. At 28 years old, Almanzo Wilder becomes partially disabled, and Laura has to carry more of the physical labour than any wife should have to bear. In 1889, Laura gives birth to a son. He dies 12 days later before they've even named him. You know that grief. You've lived that grief. You remember Freddie dying in your arms. Remember the small wooden cross that marked his grave before the floods washed it away. And now your daughter is burying her infant son, learning the same hard lessons about frontier life and infant mortality that you learned 20 years ago. Their house burns down, not damaged, gone. Everything they own destroyed by fire, leaving them with nothing but the clothes they're wearing and debts they can't pay. You watch Laura struggle the way you struggled. You watch her work herself to exhaustion the way you did. You watch her follow Almanzo even when his decisions don't make sense, because that's what wives do. That's what the marriage contract means when you have no legal rights and no way to support yourself independently, and you can't help her. You can't give her money because you don't have money. You can't offer her a place to stay because your own house is barely big enough for your remaining daughters. All you can do is watch and remember, and hope that somehow Laura finds the strength you've had to find over and over again. Charles is aging now. He's in his 50s, and the decades of hard labour are showing. His hands shake sometimes. He gets winded easily. He's given up on farming, truly given up, not just temporarily. He works as a carpenter in De Smet, doing odd jobs, earning wages instead of gambling on crops. It's the first real stability you've had in 30 years of marriage. Charles comes home every night. He brings home a paycheck, small but regular. You're not rich. You'll never be rich. But you have enough. Enough food, enough fuel, enough security to breathe without constantly waiting for the next disaster. Mary comes home from Iowa in 1889, her education complete. She's been at the College for the Blind for 7 years, learning to read raised print and braille, studying literature and music and all the academic subjects she hungered for. She can play the organ now, beautifully. She can recite poetry from memory. She's educated in ways that most frontier women never get to be, but she's still blind. And educated blind women on the frontier in 1889 don't have many options. She can't teach in regular schools. She can't marry easily. What man wants a blind wife when there are sighted women available? So Mary comes home to live with you and Charles, dependent again, her education a beautiful accomplishment that doesn't translate into independence. You're 50 years old now. You have 3 daughters still living at home. Mary at 24, Carrie at 20, and Grace at 9. Laura and Almanzo have fled South Dakota for Florida, then Missouri, looking for better opportunities the same way Charles dragged you from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa and back. The pattern repeats across generations, and you're tired of watching it. The town of De Smet has grown around you. There's a church now, a proper building instead of meeting in someone's house. There's a school, a store, a post office. Charles builds you a house in town, not on the Homestead claim, but on 3rd Street. A real house with multiple rooms and glass windows and wooden floors. It's the nicest place you've ever lived. You're 52 years old before you have a house with glass windows. You become a respected member of the De Smet community. Not because of Charles. Charles is just another aging settler. A man who works with his hands and never quite made it big. But you, Caroline Ingalls, you're respected. Women come to you for advice. They ask you to help with childbirth, with sewing, with the 100 domestic crises that arise in small frontier towns. You've become what you swore you'd never be. The woman who survived by staying, by enduring, by accepting that this is your life, and making the best of it even when the best isn't very good. And somehow, impossibly, you're content. Not happy. You've learned that happiness is too much to ask for. But content. You have a home that won't be taken away. You have daughters who are alive, even if their lives are harder than you wanted. You have a community that values you. Charles's fiddle still comes out on winter evenings. Or he plays the old songs, The Arkansas Traveler, Money Musk, and Grace dances the way Mary and Laura used to dance in the Big Woods cabin a lifetime ago. and you let yourself believe that maybe, just maybe, you've finally found something that will last. Charles dies on June 8, 1902, at home on 3rd Street in De Smet, South Dakota. He's been sick for a while. Heart problems, the doctor says, though what that means exactly is unclear. His heart is wearing out the same way his body is worn out from decades of manual labour, from breaking prairie sod and hauling timber and building cabin after cabin after cabin. He's 66 years old. You're 62. You've been married for 42 years, 4 months and 7 days. He dies in the house he built for you, the house on 3rd Street with glass windows and wooden floors. The first real home you've had since you married him at 20 years old. It should feel like cruel irony that Charles finally gave you stability just in time to die. But mostly it just feels like exhaustion, like the end of a very long journey that you're relieved to have finished. You sit beside his bed in the final hours, holding his hand the way you've held it through 4 decades of hardship. Mary is in the next room, listening because she can't watch. Carrie and Grace are there, your youngest daughters, the ones who've known only De Smet, who don't remember the years of wandering. Laura arrives from Missouri bringing Rose, your granddaughter who's now 15. The whole family is here for the end, gathered in this house that Charles built too late, watching the man who dragged you across half the continent finally stop moving. Charles doesn't have much to say at the end. He's never been good with words when emotions are involved, but he holds your hand, and he looks at you with those eyes that have been restless for 42 years, and you see something in them you haven't seen in decades. Peace. Maybe he's finally found what he was looking for, or maybe he's just too tired to keep searching. Either way, the restlessness is gone, replaced by something quieter, something that looks like acceptance. He dies quietly, his heart simply stopping in the late afternoon. No drama, no final profound words. Just a man's body giving out after 66 years of hard living, leaving behind a widow and 5 surviving daughters and a granddaughter, and a legacy that's far more complicated than any of his children will ever admit in writing. The funeral is at the Congregational Church. Reverend Brown, the same minister who married Laura and Almanzo 17 years ago, conducts the service. The whole town comes because Charles Ingalls was well liked, even if he was never successful. People remember his fiddle playing, his storytelling, his optimism, even when circumstances should have crushed it. They bury him in the De Smet Cemetery, under a simple stone that reads Charles P. Ingalls, 1836 to 1902. No elaborate epitaph, just his name and dates, marking 42 years of marriage, 5 daughters raised, a dozen moves, countless failures, and a few hard-won successes that came too late to matter much. You stand at the graveside and you feel a confusion of emotions that you can't untangle. Grief. Yes, you love Charles, even when his decisions infuriated you. Even when his restlessness cost you everything. Even when you resented him for the life he'd given you instead of the life he'd promised. But also relief. Relief that you don't have to move again. Relief that you don't have to watch him chase another horizon. Relief that you can finally stop bracing for the next disaster, because the biggest disaster, losing everything and having to start over, can't happen anymore. You're 62 years old and you're done running, and underneath the grief and relief there's something else. Pride. You survived. Charles made terrible decisions, dragged you through poverty and loss and constant upheaval, but you survived anyway. You kept your daughters alive. You maintained dignity when circumstances should have stripped it away. You built something, not wealth, not success, but a life, from absolutely nothing. The house on 3rd Street is yours now. Mary lives with you, helping with household tasks despite her blindness. Carrie lives nearby with her husband. Grace will marry in a few years and stay in De Smet. Your daughters have survived, and they're building lives of their own, and that's the only legacy that matters. Laura comes to visit when she can, bringing Rose, telling stories about their life in Missouri. She's writing now, articles for local papers, poetry, eventually longer pieces about her childhood on the frontier. She asks you questions about the early years, about Wisconsin and Kansas and the grasshopper plague, and you answer carefully, editing the truth in small ways because some things are too hard to say out loud. You never tell Laura about the midnight flight from Burr Oak. You never tell her how close you came to leaving Charles in the 1870s, when the failures piled up and you couldn't see how you'd survive another year. You never tell her that you sometimes resented her father so deeply it felt like poison in your chest. Instead, you tell her the softened version. You tell her about Charles's fiddle and his optimism and his love for his daughters. You tell her about the good moments, and there were good moments, scattered through the hardship like wildflowers in a drought. You help her build the mythology she needs, the story that makes sense of your family's suffering, the narrative that transforms random tragedy into meaningful struggle, and you live. You live for 22 more years after Charles dies, long enough to see Grace married, long enough to see Rose grow into a woman, long enough to watch the frontier you helped settle turn into towns with electricity and automobiles and all the modern conveniences that came too late for you. You die on April 20th, 1924, at age 84, in the house Charles built, surrounded by your daughters. You've outlived him by 22 years, years of stability, of community respect, of finally being settled in one place, long enough to call it home. They bury you next to Charles in the De Smet Cemetery. Your stone reads Caroline Ingalls, 1839 to 1924. 42 years of marriage, reduced to dates on matching headstones, lying side by side in the Dakota soil that Charles finally stopped running from because death made him stop. Laura is 62 when you die, the same age you were when Charles died. She's living in Missouri with Almanzo. He's writing the first drafts of the stories that will become the Little House books. She'll publish Little House in the Big Woods in 1932, 8 years after your death, and everything, all the hardship, all the failures, all the complicated truth of your marriage, will be transformed into something simpler, sweeter, more palatable for children. The real story of Caroline and Charles Ingalls will disappear under layers of fiction and nostalgia and deliberate omission. But you won't care. You'll be beyond caring, resting in Dakota soil next to the man who gave you the hardest life imaginable, and somehow, impossibly, also gave you a life worth living, because you survived. And in the end, for a frontier woman in the 19th century, survival was the only victory that mattered. Laura sits down to write in 1930, 54 years old, Habiya, living in Missouri with Almanzo, and she's about to do something that will transform her mother's suffering into American mythology. She calls the manuscript Pioneer Girl. It's an autobiography, raw and honest, written for adults who can handle the truth about frontier life. She writes about Burr Oak, Iowa, and the midnight flight from debt. She writes about near starvation during the long winter. She writes about her father's failures, her mother's exhaustion, the brutal reality of life on the margins of survival. She submits it to publishers. They reject it, again and again. The manuscript is too dark, they say, too depressing, too honest about the costs of westward expansion. Nobody wants to read about poverty and failure and children dying. But Laura's daughter Rose, your granddaughter Caroline. Though you've been dead for 6 years by the time this happens, Rose is a successful writer. She's published novels and magazine articles. She knows what sells, and she sees potential in her mother's stories, but only if they're transformed into something more palatable. Make it for children, Rose suggests. Take the darkest parts out, make it nostalgic, make it cozy, make Pa heroic instead of hapless, make Ma perfect instead of exhausted. And Laura does. She sits down and rewrites her childhood, transforming brutal reality into gentle fiction. The book that emerges is called Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932, 8 years after you died without knowing your life would become a bestseller. But here's what doesn't make it into that book, Caroline. Here's what your granddaughter Rose edits out. What Laura decides is too painful or too embarrassing to include. The entire Burr Oak period disappears. The hotel work, the midnight flight from debt, the shame of running from creditors, gone. As if that year never happened, as if your family didn't spend months living in degradation so profound that Laura herself later said it was too painful to write about. Charles's repeated failures get softened into moving for better opportunities. His restlessness becomes adventure instead of irresponsibility. His inability to prove up a homestead claim becomes romantic wanderlust instead of economic incompetence. Your labour, the endless, grinding, invisible work that kept everyone alive, gets reduced to quaint domestic scenes. You churning butter becomes a charming anecdote instead of a necessity born of poverty. You making cheese becomes Ma being capable instead of Ma having no choice because there's no money to buy food. The marital tension disappears entirely. Rose adds romantic dialogue between you and Charles that never existed in the original manuscript. She removes scenes of strain, of anger, of the quiet resentment that builds when a woman watches her husband make the same mistakes over and over while she cleans up the consequences. And here's the most revealing omission. Laura originally wrote about Mary's blindness as a tragedy that fundamentally changed your family, that added immense burden to a woman already carrying too much. But the published version? It becomes a story about frontier resilience, about making the best of things, about Pa's fiddle music making everything bearable. Rose even advises Laura to cut Mary's blindness from the books entirely. Laura refuses, writing back, "A touch of tragedy makes the story truer to life, and showing the way we all took it, illustrates the spirit of the times and the frontier. But even that touch of tragedy gets sanitized. The published version never shows you Caroline sitting alone after Mary goes blind, wondering how you'll manage with a disabled daughter and no resources. It never shows you crying yourself to sleep because you can't afford to send Mary to school. It never shows you taking in extra washing to pay for Mary's tuition, your hands bleeding from the lye soap, your back breaking from labour that never ends. The books become bestsellers. Little House in the Big Woods is followed by Little House on the Prairie, on the banks of Plum Creek, and by the shores of Silver Lake and more. Millions of children read them and fall in love with the Ingalls family, the sanitized, romanticized version where poverty is quaint, and hardship builds character, and Pa's fiddle makes everything okay. And the real story. The story of a woman who married at 20 and spent the next 42 years following a man who couldn't stay in one place, who buried a son and watched a daughter go blind and survived winters that should have killed her. That story gets buried under layers of fiction and nostalgia and deliberate omission. By the 1940s, the Little House books have created a mythology so powerful that even historians start citing them as accurate representations of frontier life. Scholars write papers about the Ingalls family without checking census records, without examining court documents, without asking if maybe, just maybe, Laura had reasons to soften the truth. And you, Caroline? You're transformed from a complex woman who made impossible choices under crushing constraints into Ma. Patient, gentle, always calm, never angry, never resentful, never human. The question is, would you have wanted this? Would you have wanted your suffering turned into bestsellers? Would you have wanted your real story erased in favour of a version that's easier for America to swallow? Or would you have preferred the truth? Let's talk about what actually happened, Caroline. Let's talk about the parts Laura left out and what they reveal about being a woman on the American frontier. You married Charles at 20 years old. You were educated, unusual for your time. You'd worked as a teacher. Earning your own money, maintaining independence that most women never had. You had choices, or at least more choices than many frontier women, and you chose Charles. You chose the restless man with the fiddle and the dreams about westward opportunity. You chose adventure over security, even though your own childhood had taught you exactly what happens when men chase dreams across dangerous water. Why? Maybe you loved him. Love is real, even when it leads to poor decisions. Maybe you believed his promises. Charles was charming, confident, full of plans that sounded reasonable when he described them. Maybe you thought you could manage it, that your competence could compensate for his restlessness. Or maybe, and this is what Laura never writes about, maybe you didn't have as many choices as it seemed. Because in 1860, some unmarried women had limited options. Teaching was temporary, poorly paid, ending the moment you married. Staying single meant depending on family charity forever. Marriage was the only path to a household of your own, even if that household came with a husband who couldn't stay put. So you married Charles, And then you spent 42 years living with that choice. Here's what the Little House books don't tell you. Divorce was nearly impossible in the 1860s to 1890s. The laws varied by state, but generally women needed to prove adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. Economic failure didn't count. Dragging your family through repeated poverty didn't count. Making terrible financial decisions didn't count. And even if you could get a divorce, then what? You'd be a single mother with 5 daughters in a society that had no place for divorced women, no job prospects, no legal right to own property in some jurisdictions, no social safety net, no child support, nothing. So you stayed. Not because you were saintly or patient or endlessly forgiving, but because staying was the only option that didn't end with your children starving. The books never mention that. They never show you lying awake at night after Freddie died, after Charles fled Bur Oak in the dark, after the grasshoppers destroyed yet another crop, thinking, I made a terrible mistake when I was 20 years old, and I'm going to pay for it until the day I die. But you probably thought it, because how could you not? Here's another thing Laura omits. Women's unpaid labour was the only reason frontier families survived. Charles could farm because you made his clothes, cooked his food, preserved the harvest. The children could survive winters because you rationed resources, made every scrap stretch, turned nothing into something edible. The family could move repeatedly because you packed and unpacked and rebuilt a household from scratch over and over, and none of that counted as work. It was just what wives did. It was invisible, uncompensated, taken for granted. When Charles succeeded, the few times he did, people praised him. When the family survived, that was also Charles's doing because he was the breadwinner, the one who provided. Never mind that you were the one who actually kept everyone alive. The Little House books perpetuate this invisibility. They show you cooking and sewing and cleaning, but they frame it as cozy domesticity instead of exhausting necessity. They make it look easy, natural, something any good mother does without complaint. They don't show your hands cracked and bleeding from lye soap. They don't show you crying from exhaustion. They don't show you losing your temper when Laura asks for something you can't provide, when Mary needs medicine you can't afford, when Charles announces you're moving again and there's nothing you can say to stop him. And here's the cruelest part. Even Laura, your own daughter, doesn't seem to fully understand what you went through. She writes about Pa's adventures. She writes about the places you lived and the things you saw. But she doesn't write about the crushing weight of responsibility you carried, the impossible choices you made every single day, the slow erosion of the person you might have been if you'd married someone else. Maybe she couldn't see it. Children rarely understand their parents' marriages from the inside. Or maybe she saw it but decided it wasn't the story America wanted to hear. Because America loves stories about rugged individualism and frontier adventure. America doesn't love stories about women trapped by economic necessity, making the best of terrible situations, surviving through grim determination instead of romantic destiny. So Laura gave America the story it wanted, and your real story, the story of a woman who chose wrong at 20 and spent 42 years living with the consequences, who survived anyway through sheer stubborn refusal to let her children die. That story got rewritten into something more palatable. Ma Ingalls, patient, gentle, always calm, making a cozy home wherever Pa decided to drag the family next. Caroline Quiner. Ingalls, exhausted, angry sometimes, doing what had to be done because the alternative was death, counting the days until maybe finally things would get better. Which one is more true? Here's what actually happened in the end, Caroline. Charles died in 1902 after 42 years of marriage. You lived another 22 years, long enough to see the frontier you helped settle turn into towns with electricity and paved roads, and all the modern conveniences that came too late for you to enjoy them when they would have mattered. Mary lived with you until you died. Blind and dependent, never married, never independent despite her education at the Iowa College for the Blind. The brilliant daughter who should have been a teacher spent her life as an aging spinster in her mother's house. Another woman whose potential was destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Carrie married and moved to the Black Hills, finally healthy after the long winter nearly killed her. Grace married and stayed in De Smet, close enough to visit. Laura was in Missouri, writing articles and raising chickens with Elman Zoo, not yet famous, not yet the author whose books would transform your suffering into bestsellers. You died on April 20th, 1924, at age 84. Your obituary in the De Smet paper was brief. Pioneer woman, wife of Charles Ingalls, mother of 5 daughters, member of the Congregational Church. Nothing about the midnight flights, or the near starvation, or the 42 years of moving. Just the sanitized public version. Respectable frontier matron, now deceased. 8 years later, Little House in the Big Woods was published. You never knew your life would become famous. You never knew millions of children would grow up reading about Ma, making maple sugar and sewing quilts and keeping a cozy cabin in the woods. And you never knew that the real story, your story, would be buried under layers of fiction. But here's what's true, Caroline, whether Laura wrote it or not. You survived. That's the first truth. You married a man who made terrible decisions, and you survived anyway. You buried a son. You watched a daughter go blind. You fled towns in the dark. You ground wheat in a coffee mill for 7 months straight. You moved more than 10 times in 40 years, and you survived every bit of it. You kept your daughters alive. That's the second truth. In an era when infant mortality was so common that mothers were advised not to get too attached to babies in their first year, you raised 5 daughters to adulthood. Mary, Laura, Carrie, and Grace all lived to old age. That wasn't luck. That was you. Working yourself to exhaustion, rationing food, making impossible choices about who got the biggest portion when there wasn't enough. You maintained dignity when circumstances should have stripped it away. That's the third truth. When you fled Burr Oak in the night, when you took in washing to pay Mary's tuition, when you accepted charity from the church congregation, you did it without losing yourself. You stayed Caroline Quiner underneath Caroline Ingalls, the educated woman who once taught school and earned her own money. And you built something. That's the fourth truth. Not wealth. You never had wealth. Not even stability until the last 2 decades of your life. But you built a family that stayed together. You built a marriage that lasted 42 years despite every reason it should have failed. You built a life from absolutely nothing, over and over again, in cabin after cabin across 4 states. That's the legacy Laura couldn't quite capture in her books. Because it's not a story about adventure or romance or the triumph of the human spirit. It's a story about endurance, about doing what has to be done because the alternative is unthinkable, about surviving not because you're heroic, but because you don't have any other choice. And that's the legacy that matters. Because here's what modern women need to understand about your story, Caroline. You didn't have the choices we have now. You couldn't leave a bad marriage and support yourself. You couldn't tell your husband no when he decided to move. You couldn't control your own fertility or your own money or your own property. You lived in a system designed to keep women dependent, and you survived it anyway. That's not romantic. That's not inspiring in the way the Little House books are inspiring. But it's true. And the reason your story matters, the real story, not Laura's version, is because it shows what women are capable of when they have no choice but to be capable. You weren't patient because patience is a virtue. You were patient because expressing anger would have made your situation worse. You weren't gentle because gentleness is feminine. You were strategic, choosing your battles, conserving your energy for the fights that mattered. The Little House books turned you into a saint. But you were never a saint, Caroline. You were a woman who made the best of a bad situation. You were angry sometimes. You resented Charles sometimes. You thought about the life you could have had if you'd married someone else, if you'd stayed in Wisconsin, if you'd never climbed into that first wagon heading west. And you survived anyway. That's the legacy that should have been written. The legacy of women who endure impossible circumstances not because they're naturally suited to suffering, but because the system gives them no alternative. The legacy of women whose labour keeps families alive but gets erased from history, because it happens inside homes instead of in public spaces. The legacy of women who survive and are then forgotten because survival isn't heroic enough for the history books. But you're not forgotten, Caroline. Not completely. Because even though Laura rewrote your story, even though the Little House books transformed you into Ma, the real story is still there. It's in census records and court documents. It's in the gaps in Laura's narrative, the things she doesn't mention, the periods she skips over. It's in the annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, published in 2014, 90 years after you died, finally revealing the darker truths Laura originally wrote before Rose edited them out. Your real legacy is this. You show us what women had to be before they had choices. You show us the cost of the American dream when it's built on the backs of women who couldn't say no. You show us that survival isn't always noble or beautiful, but it's real, and it matters, and it's worth remembering. Even when your own daughter tried to make you into something simpler. Even when America wanted the mythology more than the truth. Even when the world decided that Ma Ingalls was easier to love than Caroline Quiner Ingalls ever was. You survived. You endured. You built something from nothing. And that, Caroline, is the story worth telling. That's the story that matters. That's the legacy you earned, whether anyone chose to write it down or not. You're sitting here in 2026 watching this story about a woman who died 102 years ago, and you might be wondering why it matters. Why does Caroline Ingalls' story, a frontier woman from a completely different era, have anything to say to modern women living in a world with smartphones and careers and divorce lawyers and birth control? Here's why. Because the core of her struggle hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. Caroline couldn't leave a bad marriage because she had no economic options. In 2026, women still stay in bad marriages because leaving means homelessness, because childcare costs more than they earn, because the system is structured to keep women dependent. Caroline's labour, cooking, cleaning, childcare, managing the household was invisible and uncompensated. In 2026, women still do the majority of unpaid domestic labour, while also working full-time jobs, and that work is still invisible, still taken for granted, still not counted as real work in economic calculations. Caroline watched her husband make terrible financial decisions she couldn't stop. In 2026, married women still navigate relationships where financial power is unequal, where one partner's choices affect both lives but only one partner gets to make the decisions. Caroline moved more than 10 times because her husband couldn't or wouldn't stay put. In 2026, women are still following partners for their careers, uprooting their own jobs and friendships and support systems, because that's what partnership supposedly means, except the sacrifice only goes one direction. The details have changed. You're not churning butter or fleeing grasshopper plagues or burying infant sons in unmarked graves, but the underlying pattern, the pattern where women survive impossible situations through sheer determination, because the alternative is worse, that's still here. Housing instability in 2026 looks different than it did in 1876, but it's still disproportionately affecting women. Single mothers are still one emergency away from eviction. Women still earn less than men for the same work, making it harder to save, harder to leave, harder to build security independent of a partner. And just like Caroline's story got rewritten into something more palatable, patient Ma making a cosy home wherever Pa decided to drag the family, modern women's stories get sanitized too. You're supposed to have it all. You're supposed to balance career and family effortlessly. You're supposed to make it look easy, make it look like a choice, make it look like you're thriving instead of barely surviving. But here's what Caroline's real story teaches you. Surviving doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be inspirational. It doesn't have to be wrapped in a bow with lessons about perseverance and the triumph of the human spirit. Sometimes survival is just stubbornness. Sometimes it's doing what has to be done because the alternative is unthinkable. Sometimes it's making peace with choices you can't change, and building the best life possible within constraints you didn't create and can't escape. Caroline didn't become a saint through 42 years of hardship. She became exhausted. She became pragmatic. She became a woman who knew exactly how little control she had and worked within those limits anyway. And that's the lesson that matters. Not the romanticized version where love conquers all and pioneers build character through hardship, but the real version where women survive systems designed to keep them vulnerable, where they build lives from nothing because they have to, where they accept help even from people they fear because pride is a luxury they can't afford. Which brings us to something Laura never fully explained in her books, something that reveals just how complicated Caroline's life really was. There's a scene in Little House in the Big Woods where Caroline says something that modern readers find deeply troubling. She says she doesn't like Indians. She says she's afraid of them. She makes it clear that in her perfect world, Indigenous people wouldn't exist in the spaces white settlers are claiming. Laura wrote this honestly. She didn't sanitize her mother's prejudice, didn't try to make Caroline more palatable to modern sensibilities. Ma Ingalls was racist. That's not an interpretation or an exaggeration. That's what the text says. But here's the complication that makes Caroline's story more interesting than simple racism. Caroline also accepted help from Indigenous people when she needed it. Remember Chapter 1, when 5-year-old Caroline Quiner's father drowned in Lake Michigan and her family faced starvation? The Potawatomi families her father had traded with brought venison and wild rice. They brought practical compassion that kept Caroline and her siblings alive through that first winter after their father died. Caroline accepted that help. She ate the food. She survived because Indigenous people chose to help a white widow and her children, even though they had no obligation to do so, even though white settlers were already pushing them off their lands. And then, decades later, when Caroline was the married woman living on Osage land she had no legal right to occupy, she was terrified every time Osage families came to her cabin. She saw them as threats. She wanted them gone. She supported her husband's illegal occupation of their homeland, while simultaneously fearing the people whose land they'd stolen. This isn't a simple story about a racist frontier woman. This is a story about how white supremacy and survival get tangled together in ways that reveal the contradictions at the heart of American settlement. Caroline knew Indigenous people could be generous. She'd experienced their generosity firsthand as a child. But she also knew that white settlers were taking Indigenous land through violence and legal theft, and she knew that Indigenous people had every reason to be angry about it. Her fear wasn't irrational. It was the fear of someone who knows she's complicit in an injustice and worries about retaliation. Her racism wasn't just personal prejudice. It was the ideology that allowed her to justify living on stolen land, that allowed her to frame her family's survival as more important than Indigenous people's rights to their own homeland. And here's what makes this so important to understand. Caroline wasn't uniquely bad. She was typical. She held the same contradictory views that most white frontier women held. Gratitude for help received alongside hatred for the people who helped them. Fear alongside dispossession. Personal kindness alongside systemic violence. Laura struggled with this in her writing. She included Ma's racist statements, but also included scenes where Pa defended Indigenous people, where he insisted they weren't all bad, where he acknowledged they had reasons to be angry about white settlement. Laura wrote about wanting an Indian baby as a child, about being fascinated by Indigenous people, even as her mother taught her to fear them. She wrote about the contradiction without fully resolving it, and that's made her books controversial ever since. In 2018, the American Library Association stripped Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from a major children's literature award, citing the book's anti-native and anti-black sentiments. The debate continues. Are these books valuable historical documents that show how racism functioned on the frontier? Or are they harmful texts that normalize settler colonialism? The answer is probably both. Caroline's story matters because it shows how ordinary people, not monsters, not exceptional villains, just ordinary people trying to survive, participate in systems of oppression. How they benefit from injustice while also being victimized by other forms of injustice. How women can be both oppressed and oppressors, victims and colonizers, survivors and perpetrators all at once. This isn't comfortable. It's not the neat moral lesson that the Little House books tried to tell, but it's truer, and it raises questions about Caroline that Laura never fully answered. Did Caroline ever think about the Potawatomi families who saved her as a child, when she was fearing the Osage families in Kansas? Did she see the contradiction? Did she care? What made a woman who'd been helped by Indigenous people in her darkest moment turn around and support the dispossession of Indigenous people when it benefited her family? And how did Caroline reconcile accepting that childhood help with demanding that Indigenous people disappear from the lands her family was stealing? Those are the questions the next chapter of this story will explore. Because understanding Caroline Ingalls means understanding not just her struggles as a woman, but her complicity as a settler. Not just her survival, but who paid the price for it. And that story is even more complicated than the one Laura chose to tell. So here's where we are, 102 years after Caroline Ingalls died. She was a woman who survived 42 years of hardship through sheer determination and competence. She kept 5 daughters alive through poverty and plague and winters that should have killed them. She maintained dignity in circumstances that should have stripped it away. She endured a marriage to a man who made terrible decisions and kept the family together anyway. All of that is true. And she was also a woman who lived on stolen land, who benefited from indigenous dispossession, who expressed racist views about the very people whose help had once saved her life. That's also true. Caroline Ingalls contained contradictions. She was capable and exhausted, generous and prejudiced, a survivor and a colonizer, a victim of patriarchy and a beneficiary of white supremacy, a woman who had no choices and a woman who made choices that harmed others. Laura tried to simplify her in the Little House books, turning her into Ma, patient, gentle, always calm, a symbol of frontier motherhood without the complications. Rose edited out even more, removing the rough edges, the moments of anger, the evidence of strain that Laura originally wrote. But the real Caroline was never that simple. She was human, which means she was contradictory and flawed, and more interesting than the mythology that replaced her. The lesson here isn't that Caroline was secretly terrible, or that her survival doesn't matter. The lesson is that human beings are complicated, that you can survive genuine hardship while also participating in systems that harm others. That being oppressed in one way doesn't prevent you from being an oppressor in another way, and that lesson matters for women today. Because modern women are also navigating contradictory positions. You're fighting for equality while also benefiting from systems that oppress others. You're surviving economic precarity while your survival might depend on cheap labour from people with even less power. You're demanding justice while also being complicit in injustices you'd rather not examine too closely. Caroline's story doesn't give you permission to ignore those contradictions, and it shows you what happens when people do ignore them, how they build myths about themselves that erase the cost other people paid for their survival. The real Caroline Ingalls was a woman who made the best of impossible situations, but some of those situations were only impossible because other people's situations were made even worse. The free land Charles claimed wasn't free, it was stolen. The homestead opportunities that seemed like salvation to the Ingalls family came at the cost of indigenous people being forcibly removed from their homelands. Caroline knew this. She had to know this. She watched Osage families travel through land that had been theirs for generations, land Charles was claiming as his own, and she knew they had more right to be there than she did, and she stayed anyway. Because survival doesn't always align with morality, because feeding your children matters more than abstract justice when you're the one responsible for keeping them alive. Because Caroline Ingalls was a woman trapped in systems she didn't create and couldn't escape, making choices within constraints that guaranteed someone would suffer no matter what she did. That's the hardest truth about her story. She wasn't a saint who endured hardship with perfect grace. She wasn't a villain who deserves condemnation for her complicity in colonialism. She was a woman who survived by accepting contradictions she couldn't resolve and making peace with compromises that would have destroyed a more idealistic person. Maybe that's the real legacy, not the romanticized version where Ma makes everything okay with patience and butter churning, but the complicated version where a woman does what she has to do to survive, accepts help she later refuses to acknowledge, builds a life on foundations she knows are unjust, and lives with those contradictions for 42 years without falling apart. Because that's what survival looks like when the system is rigged. That's what it means to be human in circumstances that don't allow for moral purity. That's what Caroline Ingalls actually was, not Ma from the Little House books, but a woman who contained multitudes, who survived and harmed and endured and failed all at the same time, and understanding her, really understanding her, not the mythology but the actual person, means sitting with those contradictions instead of trying to resolve them into something simpler. Which brings us to the question this whole story has been leading toward. If Caroline Ingalls could accept help from Indigenous people as a child and then fear and resent them as an adult, what does that tell us about how racism and survival intersect on the American frontier? If she could be both victim and perpetrator, both oppressed and oppressor, both sympathetic and complicit, what does that mean for how we understand women's roles in settler colonialism? And if Laura wrote about these contradictions but then softened them for publication, what truths about frontier life got buried under layers of nostalgic fiction? Those are the questions the next part of this story will answer. Because Caroline's relationship with Indigenous people wasn't just racist. It was complicated in ways that reveal how white women participated in colonialism, while also being victimized by patriarchy. How they accepted help and gave nothing back. How they feared the people whose land they were stealing and somehow convinced themselves they were the victims. Little House on the Prairie, the second book in Laura's series, is where these contradictions come to the surface. It's where Ma's racism is most visible. It's where the violence of settler colonialism is right there in the text, barely disguised by Laura's childhood perspective. And it's where Caroline Ingalls becomes not just a survivor of hardship, but a participant in one of the darkest chapters of American history. That story, the story of Ma Ingalls on Osage land, yes, terrified of the people she's helping to dispossess, accepting their forced departure as necessary for her family's safety, that's the story that needs to be told next. Because understanding Caroline means understanding all of her, not just the parts that fit the mythology, but the parts that reveal how ordinary women became colonizers, how survival and violence got tangled together, how someone could be both victim and villain depending on whose perspective you're seeing from. So if you want to know the full truth about Ma Ingalls, the truth Laura tried to tell before it got edited into something safer, you'll need to hear what happened in Kansas. You'll need to understand why Caroline hated Indians but accepted their help. You'll need to see how a woman who'd been saved by Indigenous generosity turned around and supported their removal. Because that contradiction, that's where the real story lives, and it's a story that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the woman in the sunbonnet standing in the doorway of the Little House on the Prairie. Next time, Ma Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie, Why Caroline Hated Indians but Accepted Their Help. Book 2,